What's happening, family?
We are back.
We are back.
It's
It's
another
Sunday. It's Valentine's Day.
Happy Valentine's,
Happy
Day
Valentine's
for all
Day.
the lovers. Yes.
And it's Black History Month. And it's
Yes.
Frederick Douglass's birthday. We got a lot to talk about and celebrate today, fam. So glad you're here with us. Glad you're joining us for another broadcast of Politics in Black, brought to you by the newly minted LA arm of the NAASD.
Hey, y'all.
That's the National Assembly of American Slavery Descendants. So just quickly, if you're just now hearing that acronym, you're just now hearing about the National Assembly of American Slavery Descendants. What that is a national consortium of dozens of reparations advocacy groups around the country who are coming together for the common mission and purpose of doing the grassroots legwork that's required to push towards this goal of federal reparations and to push local legislative policy that's gonna lead into collective uplift for our people. So this is the natural evolution of our movement Friday. It feels good to be part of this organization and to be part of this important work going forward. So I can't tell you how excited I am for the NAASD to get back to work, because we recognize the urgency of this fight. So with that said, let's get into this show today, because you know how I get. I'm excited. And today, since we're here on Black History Month, I wanted to make sure that we're calling out the name Carter G. Woodson.
Yes.
Because that is a name that does not get spoken enough in this month. Carter G. Woodson, the father of Black History
Month,
who also he created Negro History Week
yes,
in 1926, which was the precursor for what we now recognize as Black History Month. And for those that don't know, Carter G. Woodson, he was an author, he was a journalist, and he wrote a seminal work in The Miseducation of the Negro, where his central thesis in that book was that blacks are being culturally indoctrinated to accept our own oppression by the American school system. So what we wanted to do today is come and we wanted to dig into that thesis a little bit with some
and we have some heavy hitters
we got some
today.
Heavy hitters. We got some people in the field of education that are going to help us peel back that onion, because ultimately Carter G. Woodson, his vision was that schools would infuse Black history into their curriculums, and there wouldn't be a need for a Black History Month or Negro History Week.
So we're not there yet.
We're not there yet.
And so for people running for office like Mr. Chibe in, I think, Michigan, who don't quite understand this history, we would like to get to the point where we see the dream, right?
Absolutely.
But until then, happy Black History Month, y'all.
Yeah, happy Black History Month, and we're going to show some love today on Valentine's Day, and we're going to show it to Black children and talking about the education that they need and they desperately want. So with that said, it's another good one Friday. Let's get into it.
It is. And so one of our special guests today, I'm so excited to talk to him because he's from Los Angeles. He has done such significant work. Dr. Shiraki Holly, a national educator who provides professional development to thousands of educators in the area of cultural responsiveness. Since 2000, Dr. Holly has trained over 150,000 educators and worked on nearly 2,000 classrooms. Going back 25 years, he has been a classroom teacher at a middle school and at the high school level, a central office professional development coordinator in LAUSD, a school founder and administrator and university professor in teacher education at Cal State University. Shiraki has also been a visiting professor for Webster University in St. Louis and a guest lecturer at Stanford and UCLA. Let us show this brother here some love.
Absolutely.
Dr. Shiraki Holly, welcome.
Dr. Holly,
Politics in Black.
welcome. Good to see you, brother. Welcome to Politics in Black. So thankful for your presence and your time today. So again, thank you for being here.
So cultural responsiveness resonates particularly, your thing is not necessarily Black. Chad and I have followed your work, and so we have an understanding. Can we just start with the basic of what cultural responsiveness is in education?
Yeah, define that for us, Dr. Holly.
Sure. In general, I'm going to say that it's really about validating and affirming marginalized cultures and languages in the context of the traditional school, and at the same time, bridging those cultures and languages to the expectations of school culture, in the context of traditional school. It's really about valuing, honoring, affirming, recognizing, you know, Black culture,
Yeah.
Latinx culture, many cultures of color in the context of the traditional school building.
Hmm.
And how can we do how can we do that in a way that lifts them up, empowers them, and at the same time gives them an understanding and appreciation of the quote unquote value of school culture here in the United States.
Yeah. And what I heard you say in one of your speaking engagements is you said that cultural responsiveness and awareness sometimes gets confused with diversity and equity, and it's not necessarily the same thing. Like they're being used as synonymous buzzwords by a lot of institutions, but you draw a distinct line between those ideologies, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, I'm really big on parsing out the terminology because a lot of it has been over the years, a lot of the vocabulary has been conflated and used interchangeably. So, I think of diversity in the context of how people traditionally think of it. We want, obviously, we want staffs of diverse backgrounds. We want diversity in Hollywood, right? And how we think of it in that way. I think cultural responsiveness differs though in that it's what happens when we become diverse,
Hmm.
right? And the example that I give Nat when I'm doing presentations is I have a lot of examples of superintendents being brought in of color, Black superintendents, gender diversity, women superintendents, but the expectation is that they're going to lead and operate as if they were a white male,
Hmm.
and that is not culturally responsive, right? So I want us to we have to be diverse and culturally responsive. And I'm trying to make that separation. I'm trying to get people to understand that separation.
And you're focusing on the actual educators, the teachers, and trying to raise their awareness and cultural responsiveness. And I heard you say that you see kind of two methods or pathways to instruction, right? The one that you labeled sink or swim, right? You basically throw the child in, you say, hey, learn and do your best. And, if you can swim, you're flailing around. If you can swim, good for you. If you can't, too bad. And the other one was, the educator being in the pool is the analogy I think you used, and helping that student learn to swim and being in the water with them. Could you expound on those a little bit, a little about those two approaches and how you see those now being played out in the current, educational system?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. The history of U.S. schooling is if you know how to do school, your chances of success increases. And I've always used a metaphor to say you have students who come to school, come to the pool already knowing how to swim.
Yeah.
In essence, they already know how to do school, and so our system is really built around those students. In essence, there are many students from various backgrounds, however, that come to the pool not knowing how to swim, and they need support. Type of support they need is for the education, the teachers, support staff, and such to be in the pool with them. Whereas the traditional schooling is to be on the outside of the pool,
Mm.
directing students, leading students, teaching students, because there's no need necessarily jump in the pool.
Yeah.
And I'm really using a metaphor based on my own kids going through swim school. And I realized while they were learning to swim, the teacher was in the pool with them.
That's right.
But once
Yeah.
they learned how to swim, now the teacher is outside of the pool
Hmm.
and they swim from side to side. And when they come to the one side of the pool, the teacher says, "This is what you need to work on. Now swim to the other side."
Yeah.
And we have many students who they don't need the teacher to be on the side of the pool. They need the teachers to be inside in the pool. And that is my metaphor for what cultural responsiveness is.
Got it.
That I think, considering countrywide, 85% of what is it? The K through 12 teachers are white women.
Yeah, white females.
That's a big ask, because I mean, in terms of cultural development and openness, that's a shift, right? You want me to get in the water with my students, is that conceptually, I think that's a significant shift. And so in terms of a national space, what would you advise? I would say maybe parents, as they're interacting with PTA associations, as they're interacting with the teachers unions sort of across the nation, how do you get that shift? Like, what would you recommend they say in terms of conversation in this space to get that shift? Because this prison, what is it? The school of prison pipeline
Yeah.
is kind of scary statistically.
No, absolutely. I think that parents need to be educated around culture responsiveness. We have not done a good job with that. So a lot of parents aren't even aware of what I'm saying. Most parents, they just want to make sure that their students are being taught versus being taught in a way that is responsive to who they are. And I don't blame parents for that, because they're living their lives and trying to do things. It's just that, it's something that if you're not made aware of, you may not even know. And then also, I think that a lot of parents, especially in the Black community, whose students can swim per se, they're still not realizing that there may be something missing, which is relevant to the theme of the show around the miseducation, right, of the Negro.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Is that just because your child is being educated, right, that means they're not really having issues within the K-12 system. That does not mean that they're being educated.
That's right.
Right, in terms of who they are. So if we look at it that way, then there's a whole kind of swath of parents that are just missing it, because typically the parents that I'm talking to are the ones of the children who can't swim, and the school is not responding to who they are. But we really need to pull everybody in and say, your child may be educated, but it may be a miseducation.
Yeah. And I want to stick on that who you are piece, that identification piece, because I've heard you talk about, I think it was the rings of identity.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you make a distinction, which I agree with, between African American and Black. And that's where we're focused here, is on those particular students. Could you talk a little bit about rings of identity?
Rings of culture.
Rings of culture. Could you talk a little bit about that and expound on that concept a little?
Sure. So like I said earlier, I'm known as the parser, right? Like I parse everything. And one of the things that I try to do is make sure that educators understand the difference between racial identity and cultural identity, which a lot of them don't, because again, our society conflates it. And when we conflate it, it what allows the conversation around racism and stereotyping and generalizations to exist, because we've conflated race with behavior. And we want to look at culture as just behavior, right? So we conflated the two. So I want educators to understand them separately. And certainly we have our students' racial identity, and I'll use myself as an example. I identify as African, right? As someone who is of African ancestry. That is different, though, than my ethnic identity, or what I would call my home culture, which is one of the rings of culture that we work with. And the rings of culture are like age culture, gender culture, socioeconomic culture. And essentially, they're all forms of identity that make up all of us, right? We have our economic identity. I have my economic identity. I grew up poor here in Los Angeles. I grew up in a home where I didn't know I was poor. But when I found out, where my mom's income was, we were poor, right? But I never knew it. But now, I'm middle class, whatever you want to call it. So I tell people when it comes to economic status, I'm bicultural, right? If I have to eat meat out of can, I'm gonna be okay, right? I've had to eat meat out of a can for many, many years, so I'm not gonna fall apart if I all of a sudden have to eat some meat out of a can. Thanks. So. Because I grew up that way. So I want people to understand the complexity and the nuance. When it comes to my ethnic culture, then I subscribe to Black culture, and all that means in terms of verbal overlap, in terms of, concept of time, right?
Right.
Yeah.
All the things that come with Black culture. And I want teachers to understand that just because you have a student who is one of a racial identity, that does not automatically mean that they're going to be of a cultural identity.
Yeah.
And it's incumbent on that teacher to get to know who that student is, to make that determination. And I can give you another example. I taught at Drew Middle School when I first started teaching, and that's where I learned that all students aren't Mexican, right? Because I had some students from El Salvador, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they broke it down for me and said, look, they call me Mr. H. Mr. H, you got to understand the difference between the students who are coming from Mexico and students who are coming from El Salvador. They are culturally different. And that kind of opened my eyes to that we have to make these distinctions and not just look at it through a racial lens.
And that's a conversation that we are having with our state legislators, because blackness can be flattened in the same way. And,
Right.
all black is not the same. There are
Right.
American descendants of slavery. There are indigenous people who have been miscategorized as quote unquote black. There are Caribbean people. And even within the Caribbean, they have their own diaspora, as, do the different cultures from the African continent itself. And so that conversation, the fact that you're able to bring that awareness into the classroom, I think is awesome. One of the things I know I heard you say was that people need to know themselves. And so you didn't quite get, you identified in what you said earlier, but if you could just quickly talk about how you get people to better understand that the race, nationality, ethnicity differences, because that's almost an exercise that I want to give to our audience so that they start looking more at themselves. And even with the rings of culture, there's national orientation, gender, religion. Talk about just how people can sort of at home have this conversation in a roundtable way, just so that they can self-identify, right? Because I think that might shift perspectives in individuals to have a more empowering conversation, particularly with the parent teacher dynamic. But talk to that a little, because I actually think that those exercises are really empowering.
Yeah, so I've been doing this exercise, for 20 years now, where I ask people to identify themselves. And I say, give me your race, your racial identity, your national identity, and your ethnic identity. And then what I tell them to do is, you can't put human for an answer, because some people, they want to go the humanist route, right? We're all human. And then I say, you can't use the same word twice. And it really stomps a lot of people. And I still have a lot of people go like, wow, I'm so confused. And it's attributed to our society and how we confuse people. That gets back to the miseducation, like how we're miseducating. So like for Black folks, most people will put Black for race and Black for ethnic. And I tell them, you can't use the same word twice. So then they might put African. If I do have diaspora in the room, they typically will get it. Like they'll say African, Jamaican, African, right? But the US Black tend to be more confused than if they're coming from the Caribbean or even from the continent. They get it immediately where I'm going with it, right? So by forcing people to make that distinction, it has a way of kind of clearing things up. So then that allows for, just like you said, a table conversation around, well, let's now talk about our ethnic culture and what it means, quote unquote, to be US Black versus Belizean or versus Jamaican. And you can just sit there all day long just having that conversation, right?
Yeah.
From food to hair to clothes. I mean, the great thing about it is there are a lot of similarities, but there are also some nuanced differences.
Yeah. I want to talk about that because I've heard you speak about cultural misunderstandings as it pertains to pedagogy for Black children, right? So you have a Black youth that might be coming from a background where something as simple as eye contact is seen as a form of disrespect, right? Like, why you looking at me, or, somebody say, what's up? If you look at it too long, right? Then that same Black youth is in the classroom and they're told by their instructor, look me in the eyes when I'm talking to you, sort of thing. That leads to this cultural misunderstanding. And then that child can then be disciplined because of this cultural misunderstanding? Could you talk a little bit about those situations and how you see it affecting Black youth?
Sure, absolutely. Long ago, you had great researchers like Wade Boykins from Howard University, Wade Nobles, of course, in San Francisco, who did a lot of research around, Black psychology and particularly Black culture behaviors that are most likely to be, and this, now I'm using my terminology, culturally misunderstood in the context of school. And in my work, I honed in on 16 particular behaviors. The first being eye contact, because it's the easiest for people to grasp conceptually. But it goes all the way to a very nuanced concept that Wade Nobles used to talk about a lot, calling immediacy, which is very intangible. And it's just that sense of connectedness that you have with somebody, like as soon as you walk in the room, right? It's immediate. And a lot of our students need that. I'm gonna give you an example of one that's kind of in the middle, such as verbal overlap, or that's part of our conversational patterns that we have within our Black language, which is we can jump in on each other and it's no problem. We can engage with one another, it's no problem. Yeah. And by verbally overlapping, and that term is a linguistic term where I can start talking while you're talking and it's understood. By me talking while you're talking, it actually shows that I'm engaged in a conversation. It shows a level of verbal agility and attunement to what's being said. And you on the corner with the brothers on the corner, they're verbal overlapping, right? They're not taking turns. They're not going, oh, you go now, you make your point about the Lakers, and then I'm going to make my point, right? So when our kids bring verbal overlap to school, as soon as they verbal overlap the teacher, what are they told? I'm talking now. Yeah. That you're being rude, right? And that is what I call a cultural misunderstanding. Those students end up in the office or end up on timeout or end up with microaggressions that eventually turns them off, because basically the teacher's not understanding who these students are. And so what I try to do is I try to educate teachers on these cultural behaviors and get them to see this is not rudeness. This is a cultural behavior that this child is bringing to school that's valid. Is a cultural asset, and you have to learn how to validate and affirm it, and not go punitive, not go negative, not go consequential. That's right. For Black students in particular, these are the proverbial broken tail lights. If you want to make a comparison to law enforcement, this is a broken tail light. And we know that what that means in law enforcement. You get pulled over for a broken tail light, and then it escalates to other things. Well, the same thing is happening for Black students in our schools. These cultural misunderstandings are broken taillights, and our kids are getting pulled over, and then it's escalating to other things. So I'm trying to stop it at the head.
So this is a random question. This is kind of off of your thing, but because of your subject matter, I'm curious to know your answer to this. And I forget the professor who started the Ebonics thing, but they wanted to do the Ebonics thing in the schools because their hope was, because Black kids and Black folks speak differently, when we are amongst ourselves, we do the verbal code switching. Their hope, though, was for students who needed speech therapy to be able to get the extra funding in school, and that didn't happen. Like, folks were like, there's no such thing as Ebonics, but if you hear my granddaddy talk, you might think a little differently. He's a Southern man, and he definitely has a little twang in his speech. And so what kind of is your thought process on that? Because I know we spend culturally a lot, especially here in like the state of California, on English as a second language for students, but we don't necessarily focus on like Black students whose English is, I don't even want to say is substandard. It's substandard maybe for traditional school culture, but it may be consistent with their home culture. And so I just am curious to your response to that.
Well, that's actually the foundation of everything, because a lot of the work that I'm doing started with the Ebonics controversy under the tutelage of Dr. Norman Lemoyne, who at the time was the director. The LA Unified had a program called the Language Development Program for African American students that now still exists. It's just called the Academic English Mastery Program. So we've always practiced the validation and affirmation of home language, which we call, there are unaccepted languages that the schools don't accept, which the research calls non-standard languages, the main four being African-American vernacular or African-American language, Black English, whatever you want to call it. And then you have Chicano English, Hawaiian Pidgin English, and then some native dialects. So all those are considered unaccepted in the school. But there's been a specific program in LA Unified for the past 40 years addressing this on one level or another. So I'm big. I mean, if you look at my background is in what you're talking about right now. It's just has expanded to the cultural behavior piece because of all the discipline issues going on in schools. But we are all for validating, affirming home language. The Ebonic, they're known, a lot of people, again, it's just a miseducation.
Yeah.
People don't understand that the Ebonic languages had enslaved Africans taken throughout the diaspora.
Yes.
So wherever you had the enslaved Africans taken.
I mean, it's like so prominent, I think, in our culture, even, when the enslaved were trying to learn English, and to learn spelling, like they created their own dialect so that they wouldn't get in trouble. And so like, this is really deeply rooted in our culture. It's good to know that that's here with LAUSD.
And one thing I'd like you to touch on, Dr. Holly, I think we got like 2 minutes here, but is sticking on Ebonics, that deficit thinking model around Ebonics and how it's been portrayed in mainstream media, because, it's portrayed as broken English, et cetera. Can you talk a little bit about how that is affecting cultural responsiveness and awareness?
Well, I mean, the bottom line is, my feeling is anything that is authentically Black is not valued by mainstream culture, right? Outside of music, maybe you can make an argument for music, right? And so I would include language in that. Part of it is just that we have a great ignorance when there's been overwhelming research on the whole notion of Ebonics. Like, you could spend the rest of your life reading the books that have been written about Ebonics, but we just haven't done a good job of educating folks, even in our own community. We just have not done a good job. So, it's all about the way you get at deficit thinking is by educating. It's that simple.
Yeah.
And I find in my work that once people understand and become aware, it changes some mindsets. But if you stay in a position of ignorance and you only get your information from mainstream media, then you're gonna continue. It's gonna continue the cycle. So that's why myself and others, we're just out here pounding the street, just trying to educate folks, to let them know that our language is valid. It has a history that you can tie all the way back to West Africa. You can tie the what we call, quote unquote, Black English today. There are some elements of it that I could show you go all the way back to West Africa.
That has been a lesson.
That's a whole nother show, Dr.
Yeah,
Holly.
that is. That's a whole nother show.
We got to bring you back for that one.
You all can find Dr. Holly at culturallyresponsive.org. Do you have social media you want to share with our audience?
Sure. We're at Validate Affirm, one word, just Validate Affirm, just one word. That's where all our social media is.
Awesome. Thank you so much for today.
Thank you, Dr. Holly.
Absolutely. Keep it up. Keep up the great work. Keep doing what you're doing.
All right. Peace, brother. Thank you. You too.
All right.
That was, you know what?
That's a good start.
That's a good start.
Yeah.
And where we're going is even better. But listen, we're going to go to a quick commercial break. And when we come back, we have a heavy hitter.
We do. We're going to get deep. We're going to get real deep.
This is a teacher of Dr. Holly. That's how deep we're going.
So like the video, share the video, subscribe.
And to our mods, thank you.
Subscribe if you like what we're doing here. You can also hit us on the Cash App, NAASD, or you can donate via the Super Chat, because we're going to keep doing this, y'all. We'll be right back from break. Stick with us.
Now! Justice! Now! Justice! Now!
Racial injustice is still the black man's burden and the white man's shame.
Justice! Now!
So wherever we live in America,
Justice!
we have to face the fact honestly
Justice!
that racial discrimination is present.
Now!
So don't get complacent.
Justice! Now!
Certainly we've made some strides. We made
What's happening, family? We're back from our break. That was a quick break.
That was a
good
quick break.
That was a quick break that time. But we're back and we're ready to get on with this conversation about the miseducation of the Negro. And so I'm very excited to bring in our next guest. His name is Dean James D. Anderson. He is a dean of the College of Education, the Edward William and Jane Marr Goodskill Professor of Education, and affiliate professor of History, African American Studies, and College of Law at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. His scholarship focuses on the history of U.S. education, with a subfield on the history of African American education. His book, The Education of Blacks in the South, 1860 to 1935, won the American Educational Research Association Outstanding Book Award in 1990. Anderson was elected to the National Academy of Education in 2008. His past research focuses on the history of African American education in the South, the history of higher education, desegregation in Southern states, and the history of public school desegregation, institutional racism, and the representation of Blacks in secondary school history textbooks. So please give a warm welcome to Dean James D. Anderson.
Woohoo!
Dean Anderson, it's so good to see you. Thank you, sir, for being here today.
Good to see you also. And can you hear me well?
We hear you.
We can. We hear you and we see you well. You're looking good, sir.
Thank you.
So I wanted to first start because we were turned on to your book by Dave Dennis on a previous show, who is a freedom rider, civil rights activist. He told us about your work. He said we had to read it. So I picked it up immediately, and I got to tell you, I haven't been able to put it down. You have put together a comprehensive history of Black education in the South, post-Civil War, through the Great Depression, and you've put it in a light that not too many other authors and educators have. So I wanted to really start at the beginning of your book, pre-Civil War, and talk about the conditions of Blacks at that time in America and what we were doing to try to educate ourselves, even though the plantation system, the regime of slavery, was against the education of the Negro at that time.
Okay, thank you. The history of African American education in the South has several phases, and the pre-Civil War is an important one. The first schools for African Americans were 1695 in South Carolina. And so for a long time, African Americans were able to achieve some level of literacy, even as slaves. And then in 1740, South Carolina became the first state to pass an anti-literacy law to try to shut it down. But it didn't really shut it down. It continued to grow. And other Southern states began to react in the early 19th century, the first third, particularly after the slave revolts of Prosser and Nat Turner and then Mark Visa. So the Southern states tried to shut down literacy. I think at the beginning of the 19th century, among slaves, literacy was at a rate of around 15%. And by the end of slavery, that is in 1860, it had declined to around 10% because of the anti-literacy laws. Yeah. But nonetheless, in the antebellum period, and now I'm talking about the 1850s, a lot of African Americans, particularly slaves, achieved literacy through secret meetings, secret means. Yes. And so there was some level of literacy and an effort to sustain it throughout the end of throughout slavery into the 1865. And so I would say about 10% or so of slaves were literate at the outbreak of the Civil War. And that's a large number. You're talking 40, 50,000 individuals who were able to disseminate knowledge to the rest of the slave population
when it was illegal to do so.
Had the opportunity to do so.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's powerful. So 1695 was the first instance of schools. I just wanted to repeat that because that's powerful.
And people don't know that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
it speaks to the commitment.
A school established in South Carolina, Goose Creek Parish, in 1695.
Yeah.
So as early as that, African Americans had their own school. Now they eventually shut it down, but by that time they'd gotten the taste of literacy, and literacy was spreading throughout the African American community, throughout the slave community.
Absolutely. I want to ask you a little bit about John Alvarez and some of the things that he observed, the National Superintendent of Schools for the Freedmen's Bureau, because a lot of what you write in the first chapter is kind of through his perceptions and discoveries as he came from the North to, report on Black Southern education. Could you take us through a little bit of what he was able to see and his perceptions?
Yes. Arthur was much like many of the Northern missionaries, except he was working for the Freedmen's Bureau when they went south. They had heard so much about slavery and had developed the notion that the slave community was a kind of infantile, childlike community that could not take care of itself, could not govern itself. Mm-hmm. And so they were shocked to see when they arrived in the South that African Americans were not sitting around on some kind of merry-go-round waiting on missionaries to help them.
That's right.
They had started their own schools. They had started their own educational organizations. They had elected their own officials. They were taking part in state and local boards of education, particularly after military reconstruction in 1868. And so he was surprised to see this African American community taking care of its own business, the level of self-determination, but not just the spirit of self-determination, but the implementation of organization and schools. And so he began to report that back to his Northern friends and also to the Freedmen's Bureau. He was telling them that this community is not what I expected. I did not expect them to be as active and as self-determined and shaping their own education as he found them.
Yeah. The commitment to education that rolled over from enslavement to post-emancipation. That's what really got me when I was reading the book.
And well, these were also tradespeople. I mean, the artistry, the work that was done, the level of skill, whether it was, making Jack Daniels wealthy or doing the iron work that we see in New Orleans. I mean, the reality is these people were tradesmen.
Yeah, skilled. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Very skilled, very highly skilled.
Much more than people know. About 2/3, that is about 67% of all the craftsmen in the South were African Americans at the end of the Civil War.
Wow.
And so we know what they can do. We've seen it in New Orleans. They built the White House.
Right.
Yeah.
So
we still got to get in it, but we built it. That's right.
And this is what he was discovering. He was discovering not this infantile, ignorant slave who did not know how to take care of their communities and their families, but people who were brilliant, people who were skilled, people who could do everything that other human beings could do. And of course, because of their racial perceptions, they were surprised at this. But the African American community was not surprised because they had been doing this for almost 2.5 centuries.
Yeah.
So can we talk a little bit about the setbacks? The African American community had indeed established education and advocacy for themselves in that space. And then there was sort of this dumbing down that was done very purposefully.
Absolutely.
By the public school system sort of coming into development. And
let me zoom in on that point, because you actually touch on that in chapter 2 of the book when you discuss the Hampton Institute and Samuel Chapman Armstrong. And so I think that's a great lens to take that question through, Friday, is Samuel Chapman Armstrong, the Hampton Institute, which leads into Tuskegee and Booker T. Washington. So I want you to take us there.
The other HU. No, let me not throw shade.
I want you to take us through that journey, Dr. Anderson, because I think that is very illuminating on current educational situation.
Well, there were these competing models, competing philosophy as to how the African American community should be educated. And Armstrong, who actually came from Hawaii, his father had been Minister of Public Education in Hawaii and had established schools there. And so he brought that philosophy to the U.S. when he came to study at Williams College. And that was a notion that people of color, dark-skinned people everywhere, not only in Hawaii, but in the U.S., should have a kind of education that would prepare them for the lowest levels of occupation and of and no participation whatsoever in government and things like. And so, this philosophy of I call it a philosophy of servitude.
Yes.
That was developed, and they tried to, with the help later of philanthropists and powerful organizations, to impose this model throughout the African American South. They weren't able to do so, by the way. Yeah. They were successful in some places like Hampton and for a while at Tuskegee up until the 1930s or so. But the African American community had already had substantial experience in the kind of education they wanted for themselves and for their kids. And they always, and that's the thing to keep in mind, they always made freedom and equality inseparable from education. So they resisted any kind of education that would not support their aspirations for freedom and equality. And so in the long run, the dominant model of education in the African American community was not the Hampton Tuskegee model, but one that flowed directly from the antebellum South, from the ex-slaves through military reconstruction and that strong fight for freedom and the right to vote. And that continued throughout the 19th century into the 20th century. And even when they established the Jim Crow system, African Americans still resisted that, because for them, education could never be separated from their push for freedom and equality. But they tried to offer a model that would make African Americans complacent with a lower station in life, and to educate them, no more than what was needed for the unskilled and common labor occupations in the American South.
Yeah.
Structural racism.
Yeah, no, and it goes to what Carter Woodson said as well. You control a man's thinking, you don't have to worry about his actions.
Right.
So it sounds like that was the core purpose and drive of Armstrong with Hampton Institute. And then I want you to touch on just a little bit the night school at Hampton Institute.
Yeah, that part was
with Booker T. Washington as principal. Could you touch on that, please? Yeah,
because the notion was that that they would supply a kind of education, and they called it sort of respect for labor. But the notion was that they were training an African American population, and they realized that the African American population was the mainstay of Southern agricultural labor. About 6 to 7 or 7% of the workers in the tobacco industry, in the cotton industry, in the sugarcane industry, and the rice production in South Carolina, that these industries, in fact, the South's economic wealth was on the backs of African-American agricultural laborers. So the notion at Hampton was that to train teachers who would go out and then train young people, particularly in the elementary school, because there was very few high schools at the time, that would train them to appreciate this kind of labor, to commit themselves to being tobacco and rice and cotton and sugarcane producers. And they would leave all higher levels of occupation to the white South. And so this philosophy of education was really built into an economic view of the post-Civil War South.
Yeah, and that economic view included the political disenfranchisement of blacks to be able to maintain that racial hierarchy.
There wasn't teaching on how to run a farm and manage the farm, just how to do the labor and the work on the farm.
That's right.
Yes,
that's right.
And let me. You mentioned something that I want to speak to, the disenfranchisement.
Absolutely, please.
What I know now, which was not in the book, and I've written about it since then, is that under military Reconstruction, the majority of voters registered in 1868 in the American South were African Americans.
Wow.
And then they went to the Constitutional Conventions in 1868 and rewrote the constitutions of every state in the American South. But they also elected their officials to local and state boards of education. And roughly from 1868 to 1900, if you look at the education of African American kids in the South compared to whites, on many metrics, like length of school term, pay for teachers, level of school funding, it was equal to that of whites, pretty much. It wasn't until blacks were disenfranchised in the late 19th century, removed from political office, and removed from having any kind of say-so in how education would be run by the local and state level, that beyond 1900, we got the Jim Crow system. Mm-hmm. And so they replaced a system that was moving toward equality for one that was deeply moving toward inequality.
Yeah. And we're not partisan on this show, Dr. Anderson, but I do want to kind of call out our enfranchisement that occurred under the Republican Party. Is that correct? And then when we saw our disenfranchisement, it really was the Democrats.
Oh, yeah, the traditional Democratic Party, because the South was Democrat. Okay. I mean, for a long time. Even now, if you go back and look at some of the legislators in Congress now, like Shelby from Alabama, they were elected originally as Democrats.
Yeah.
And they switched to the Republican Party after the passage of the 1964 and 1965 Civil Rights Act. Mm-hmm. But it was the Republican Party in power when you had military reconstruction and the first enfranchisement of the African-American community. And that community was disenfranchised by the traditional Democratic Party. Mm. So both parties have a role, because what is kind of ironic is that the voter suppression we see today, yep, and the disenfranchisement we see today is being done by the Republican Party. But in the late 19th century, and the Civil Rights Act the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed to correct the disenfranchisement that had been sustained for about 6 or 7 decades by the Democratic Party.
Mm-hmm. And I want to talk. So let's skip ahead just a little bit.
I want to skip a lot. I'm so curious just to know what you mean, what you think of today's educational system, because there was a 2017 report in the state of California that 75% of Black boys couldn't read with proficiency. We see remnants of the things that you talk about in your book, just in the data points that come out today.
Absolutely.
But I'm gonna let Chad do what
No,
Chad
no, because you went exactly where I wanted to go. So in addition to California, just as a global power, the United States of America has fallen down the educational, rung, relative to other countries, right? So I pulled up this 2015 Pew Research Center report, and at the top of science, mathematics, and reading, you see Singapore, and then you see United States, halfway down the list at 24, 39, and 24 respectively across those categories. Yep. So I've heard you talk about political disenfranchisement, which is also economic disenfranchisement, which is also educational disenfranchisement. So could you expound on that a little bit in the current day where
we're not even industrial anymore. We're service oriented country, and we are a tech oriented country.
Absolutely.
So it's all this is all so relevant and relative.
So with all that, Dean Anderson, the floor is yours.
Well, a big part of falling down and not keeping up with our competitors around the globe has to do with the structural inequality and the systemic racism. What we know in America is that we have a growing population of students of color. They're just about majority of the K-12 population. And so if America is going to keep pace, it's going to have a policy of development to educate these populations to the same level as the best education for the more elite schools in America. Now, let me say something about those test scores. When you look at those test scores, it seems like America is behind, and they are in general. But when you go inside, and that's what the College Board does, and if you ask the question, what about American students who have the best education? And let's take as an example those students who have the greatest access to AP courses in math and physics and sciences. If you disaggregate them from the general population, here's what we find: that American students who get a score of 3 at AP math, they score number 1 in the world. That for American students that take AP physics, they score number 1 in the world. Mm-hmm. It's the rest of the Americans who don't have access to the best education, to the best teachers, to the best curriculum that reflect the general downturn of America's on these international tests of math and science and reading tests. And so if we want to keep pace with the rest of the globe, with Singapore, with Japan, with Korea, and place South Korea, we are going to have to educate the whole population. And we're going to have a very active and focused policy of development for Black and brown students who are making up a larger proportion of the K-12 population, and at the same time are not well educated, as pointed out in the California study. And when they take those same tests, the nation's going to fall down because they're not prepared to be successful on those tests.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. We got to disaggregate. We
Well,
gotta
yes.
see it for what it is.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And it's another way of saying that not everybody is being miseducated.
Well, no, and the
Very
AP, you know, I'm someone who had AP in high school, and I think I don't know why it's not started sooner, if that makes sense. I mean, AP is supposed to be like the high school thing, but I just think in terms of the transition from middle school to high school, some of those concepts can be introduced sooner, and I don't know. Anyway, my two.
No, you're making a good point, because there are pre-AP tests in the 9th grade that let everyone knows, and all the educators and teachers, who is likely to be successful in those courses. And a lot, I should say, much more, many more African-American students, Latinx students, and even Native American students as well, scored well enough on those tests to have access to AP courses, but they don't have access. In part because sometimes they're in schools where there are almost no AP courses. There are high schools that may have one, and there are other high schools that may have 30.
Yeah. One of the things I loved about the book, and I still have a couple pages to finish, but I'm engrossed. One of the things I loved is just how you connect political disenfranchisement to educational disenfranchisement. We talked about that a little bit. So I wanted to zoom in on, one of the most consequential moments in our educational history as Black Americans, and that's, Brown v. Board, that desegregated, for all intents and purposes, public education. So I'd like to get your thoughts on the impact of Brown v. Board, because I read some things in your book that I don't think most people would think about as far as negative impacts. I'd like to get your thoughts around Brown v. Board and how it impacted our educational opportunities and access.
Well, I think it's fair to say that the African American and its community in particular, as well as the Latinx community, are very much justified in being extremely disappointed at the impact of Brown v. Board of Education. My interpretation and characterization of Brown v. Board of Education is that the Supreme Court ruled correctly, but the southern states, local communities, as well as many northern states and local communities, resisted desegregation. They did not want to desegregate. So what did they do? They tried their best to enact a system of desegregation that punished African Americans, punished the people who were behind Brown v. Board of Education. And you can see that in very real terms, the wholesale dismissal of African American teachers throughout the South, the wholesale dismissal of African American principals. As you know, before Brown, every elementary school, every high school, and all of the 17 southern states in the District of Columbia had Black principals, and most of those schools had all Black teachers.
Yep.
Can you put some numbers around that for us, Dr. Anderson? Just so we understand the scale of that.
The scale of the teachers?
Yes.
Yes. You're talking about tens of thousands, 50,000 or more that was dismissed just around 1968.
Wow.
And so they continue to be. And so when we look at that system now, you find very few African American teachers still in the field because they were dismissed. And once they were dismissed, they were not willing to tell their young people to go into a field that had treated them so badly.
Yes. And
so we're still struggling to regain the presence of African American teachers as well as African American principals in our educational system. And they're so badly needed for young people as role models, as exemplars, and as people who have some experience on how to educate them. Mm-hmm. And so you saw that punishment. You saw the punishment also in the destruction of Black high schools. Not all those high schools were bad high schools. Many of them were great high schools. And there were high schools across the South where they had produced very, very important leaders. College attendance rate was very high. And so it was almost like a system of desegregation that would devastate the Black community's educational system in every way possible. Its teachers, its principals, its schools, its curriculum. And African-American students, as we know, when we talk about the first generation that went into Little Rock, Central High, or went into other places, they went into classrooms that was extremely hostile. And so it took its toll. And in time, the African-American community developed a very negative attitude about desegregation. I think desegregation still has some things to offer, but it's going to be difficult to mount a new active program of desegregation when the African-American community is very unwilling to participate.
And we are reparationists, I should say that. And so if reparations HR 40, there's a hearing on the 17th of this month, which is in a couple of days, around reparations and the commission to study reparations for African Americans. With all of your research and all that you know, if you had like one or two things that you would think appropriate in terms of education space for African Americans, what would you propose? What would be suggestions from you based on the historical findings that you've presented in your book?
I have several things. The one point I want to make, which really made me a raging reparationist.
Raging reparationist.
I'm gonna use that, Dean.
Like
I'm gonna use that.
I was actually, since the book, I was looking at the passage of the 14th Amendment and right after the Civil War, and really going through the congressional record there. And I saw that the first request for reparations came from the slave owners. That the slave owners wanted the U.S. Congress to pay them for the emancipation of slaves, and in fact, they did so in Washington D.C.
They got it,
So they were paid. So that was one point. Another point, which you probably picked up in the book, because with the Rosenwald schools, you remember that if you haven't got to that part, you'll find out that in order for African Americans to have public schools at the elementary level, when the South was denying them, they had to form a partnership with the Rosenwald Fund, in which African Americans had to pay out of their pockets their private money for schools. But as part of that, they deeded land over to the state so that African American kids could have schools. And that's thousands of acres of land, as well as the money. I think the Southern states owe reparations because they refused to provide public education and forced the African American community to give both their private dollars as well as their private land to sustain an elementary school system. These are the kinds of things under democracy that no state should be allowed to get away with. They should have to account for this kind of oppression and this kind of literally taking of land and money for African Americans in order to provide a school system that otherwise should have been provided by the state.
Amen.
So that's one. And now to the contemporary question, I think in so many ways, let's say something as simple as early childhood education, for instance, for African American students, which should be good for all students. And we think about the other things, the quality of teachers. And if we wanted to get African Americans back into the educational system as principals, as teachers, reparations could provide the kinds of scholarships, the kind of full rides that would be aimed directly at bringing African American young people back into education as teachers, as principals, as superintendents, to diversify the educational leadership. Now, there are programs out there like Call Me Mister, which started at Clemson, which is working to bring African American males back into the educational system. And the point you made about California, one thing that might help that is the presence of African American males in elementary school.
Yes.
And as teachers, as principals, as role models for the kids. And so there's a lot you can do with the kind of scholarships, the kind of development programs that would seek to bring African Americans back into the system, knowing that they were pushed out by a very corrupt form of desegregation.
Thank you for that.
That was powerful.
Very.
That was powerful. Dean Anderson, do we have any more time here?
We have, I think, about 2 minutes.
About 2 minutes?
Sir, you are one of the most decorated educators that I know. I would encourage our audience to really buy the book. I on Twitter earlier today, just so you know, what is it? The UNC Press website, uncpress.org, actually has your book for 40% off today. Using code 01DAH40.
I paid full price because it's just that good. Just letting y'all know.
Well, I just want to put it out there because it's a very powerful read. Because we, in Politics and Black, we like to go back into our history as a people in this nation. I think that this particular book really does a beautiful presentation of history and things that we just didn't know.
Yeah, absolutely.
And to the extent that we are learning and we promote learning and we have the reparations, I just want to say, buy the book.
Please buy the book. Dean Anderson, is there any other way other than buying the book that we can help support you, that the family needs to know about? How can they engage with you further to hear more and ingest more of this information? Because we skipped over so much.
Yeah, one thing I would say, and that may be for people who may have some impairments for reading, that North Carolina is now going to have the book, what do they call it? Someone to read it so that...
Audiobook?
Audiobook?
Yeah, audiobooks. They're doing an audiobook.
Okay.
Nice.
And so I think about people who may have some difficulty in reading, could have some impairment and so forth. But I think that's going to be critical to get it out. So, and the other thing that, I think beyond the book, I think somehow we need more documentaries that would be available and accessible to the public. People who may not be part of a professional audience or inclined to read a book about African American education. But when you think about documentaries that have been done, that they actually could listen and see and get a sense of, because I think I think it's important to know, people can easily think that African Americans somehow have a history of devaluing education.
Yes.
They have a history of not really, of having aspirations for brilliance and for greatness.
Yes.
And that is the thing that needs to be dismantled. They need to know that for a people who gave their last penny to pay for education for their children when the states denied them, how can you then look at the same people and say they didn't value education?
Amen, Dean Anderson. Amen. That's a powerful note. I think we can wrap there.
Wrap on that.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir, for being here. Again, for folks watching and or listening, the code at UNC Press website is 01DAH40. Dr. Anderson, sir, Dean Dr. Anderson, thank you so much.
I think he's a doctor too. I think you're a doctor too. Is that right? Yeah.
That's correct.
Yes.
So thank you also for the invitation. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. We want to stay in touch, Dean Anderson. So if we reach out again, please come back on.
Okay.
All right, sir. Thank you.
Whew.
Thank you.
Man, so many gems and jewels in that conversation in that book.
I have to confess, I did not know that our black people had to pay.
Oh yeah, no.
Land and gave up land.
Yeah.
Just in order to be educated, and people want to tell us to get over it and forget about it, and it's like, no, reparations will cure this country. Reparations will allow us as Americans to be better human beings and have better understanding and knowledge with each other. You can't live in this country and walk in ignorance. You cannot. It is your responsibility as an American to actually learn this history.
To become a raging reparationist.
A raging reparationist, and to be proud to be American at the same time.
Absolutely.
I know you have that ACA3.
I do. Real quickly, fam. We're going to give you the call to actions, but before I do that, I just wanted to shout out the Sacramento media team for those Fix HR 40 promos.
Woo-hoo!
They've been doing some great work, so I just wanted to give y'all flowers. Thank you for the videos. They're awesome. We're going to continue to run those.
And the Fix HR 40 team.
And the Fix HR 40 team and the campaign, because we can't ignore HR 40. We got to get engaged and active with HR 40 to make sure that if it's going to pass, that it passes
the
with
right
the right way and with the right language. So,
and we're going to do a special clubhouse at 6. I should just throw that in there. 6 p.m. We're going to do a special clubhouse.
Shameless plug for Clubhouse. I'm not on there, y'all. No, I don't do that.
Chad's not going to be there.
I'm not coming there. But anyway, I do have another call to action around a California bill that has just been proposed by Assembly Member Sidney Kamlager of District 54.
Woohoo! My district.
Your district. And so this one's ACA 3. That's ACA 3, or otherwise being called the California Abolition Act. So in brief, as it currently reads, the Constitution of California prohibits slavery and involuntary servitude except to punish crime. ACA 3, the California Abolition Act, would amend the California Constitution to remove such conditional language, abolishing slavery and involuntary servitude without exception. So just so fam, so you recognize the scope of this, there are an estimated 115,000 Californians currently incarcerated. And there's an expectation that many able-bodied incarcerated people will perform some type of labor, oftentimes for as little as 14 cents an hour.
Yeah, the firefighters get a whole $1.
Yeah. But so the solution, ACA 3. So the California Abolition Act would amend Article 1, Section 6 of the California Constitution to prohibit slavery and involuntary servitude without exception. Building off the momentum of statewide efforts in Colorado, Nebraska, and Utah, where similar legislation has already been passed, the California Abolition Act pushes our state towards codifying complete and unconditional abolition.
And abolitionists exist in 2021.
We sitting right here.
Reparationists exist in 2021. There's some things that we have to do to get our country right. And so
that's the call to action, fam. Be on the lookout. We're going to track ACA 3 and we're going to send you updates. This is likely going to be a ballot measure. So just like we mobilized around Prop 16, around AB 3121,
we're going to
mobilize around ACA 3.
A side note, Los Angeles, Sidney Kamlager is also running for office. So just be looking out for your ballots. We have a special election, so make sure you vote. Yep. This is an off season, but it's a time that we need to show up and show out for proper representation in Assembly District 54.
Absolutely. So with that said, we got a special segment for you folks today that we decided to put on because things are happening with AB 3121.
AB 3121 is starting to seat commissioners, y'all. We're so excited about that.
Starting to see commissioners. So we wanted to do a special segment where we bring those task force members to you. We introduce you to them because one of the things that we want to make sure we're always promoting and fostering is transparency. And we want you to know the people that are going to be tasked with this important undertaking. So with that, Friday,
we have a council member Monica Montgomery Stepp. She grew up in the 4th Council District, earning a bachelor's degree in political science from Spelman College, one of our HBCUs, and is a Juris Doctor from California Western School of Law. In the 4th Council District, Monica strongly advocates for equitable practices in government, including better economic opportunities for Black people. The council member serves as chair of the Committee on Public Safety and Livable Neighborhoods, the Committee on Budget and Government Efficiency and Active Transportation and Infrastructure. At City Hall, Monica fights for the socioeconomic advancement of every person, family, neighborhood, and community member. She has demonstrated the courage, commitment, consistency, and civic knowledge to get it done in the 4th District. That's down in San Diego, y'all. Mm-hmm. Monica has received many notable accolades and awards, including 2018 Voice of San Diego, Voice of the Year, and 2019 San Diego Democratic Party Making a Difference Award, and the 2021 Ashley L. Walker Social Justice Award from the Alliance of San Diego. Please welcome Councilmember Monica Montgomery Stepp.
Councilmember Stepp.
Hello.
Thank you so much for being here today.
We're so excited. I know.
On your Valentine's Day.
Yeah, but this is certainly worth it, and I'm really excited to be here. You guys already have me jazzed and pumped up, so I'm ready to go.
Absolutely. Well, we thank you for being here. So, am I right? They call you the People's Council member. Is that right? I just want to make sure I got that.
Yeah, that came from a community member, a professor at San Diego State University, and when he said it, loved it, and it's stuck. So I'm honored to have that. And
Well,
I didn't give it to myself, but I certainly carry it.
what we say here is when you're doing great work, people give you great nicknames. So that's a
That's
great
a
one.
good
So
one.
you must be
Yes.
doing the work.
Yes, yes. So look, you're a civil rights attorney.
Yep.
And so talk to us a little bit about your experience as a civil rights attorney, and I don't know how you kind of see the commission. I know in talking to Dr. Weber, her focus was kind of on what can the state of California do, but she also wanted to position the commission to really sort of push the federal legislation of reparations. But I want to hear about your civil rights lawyering and tell us about yourself.
Yeah, so what we've been able to do in San Diego, I think early on when I graduated from law school, some of the work that I did was around employment discrimination. I did work during that time. A lot of people were losing their homes all throughout the nation, but especially here in California. So really, we were focused on that and focused on helping people, especially, who was most impacted was Black people,
Yes.
to keep one of their only possessions that they had for inheritance for their families. And so that was really, really important. But moving forward, I was a staffer at City Hall for 3 different elected officials. The last elected official that I worked for doing policy in these areas of humanitarian and civil rights, she made a comment. We had a racial profiling study done, and it did show that Black people were much more likely to be pulled over and less likely to have any type of contraband than their white counterparts. And she made a statement that Black people get pulled over because they commit all the crimes. And this was an African-American woman. And so I left the office and I went over to the ACLU and ran the local campaign on bail reform. Had quite a bit of interaction with state officials around that because we were ultimately pushing what was at the state level, but getting local folks informed and tuned in to what was going on and how important that effort was. So after that, I decided to run against my former boss. That was a hard decision. She was an incumbent and had all of the institutional support behind her, but except for 2 unions that supported me in that race, and the power of the people. Really, it was a people effort. People showed up. They took ownership of what we were doing because they were involved, and they really believed that I would carry that voice at City Hall. And I'm grateful to be doing that now. It's a very intentional thing every day. I have to get up and be dedicated to it because the inside is really hard, and there's a lot of different ways you can go, but I'm committed to the people of San Diego, the people specifically in this district, as you said, the 4th district in the city of San Diego where I grew up.
Awesome.
I just love the fact that you about the people. Like anytime I hear that, it warms my heart because that's where I am at. So thank you for doing that work. So on AB 3121, you were just recently selected to that task force or appointed to that task force. Could you talk to us a little bit about how you became, first of all, aware of AB 3121, and then where does the desire come from to participate in that process?
Yeah, well, Dr. Weber was my assembly member.
Now Secretary of State. Yep.
And so I, along with what she did with AB 392, which I led a local push down here to endorse that through our city council via resolution, always keeping up with what she's doing at the state, among others. And so that was, for me, it was important that I be involved in that, even if it wasn't on the commission. I certainly believe in reparations. I think it's the only way to make African Americans in particular whole. And so it's always been of interest to me, and especially special because Dr. Weber carried it. So been following it, and when the opportunity came up, I really, despite everything, despite capacity, I said, I'll let some stuff go to be a part of this, and I'm excited about it because I know there's such a body of work in this area. I know that there are so many people that have put so much time into what reparations looks like. And I'm looking forward to assembling those people, giving them my ideas, them sharing their ideas. I've been reading and reading and reading since before this, but particularly now, because it's very important for me, to be prepared and to put my best foot forward. So I'm really excited about it, and have, been following it.
Okay. So do you have From Here to Equality? Because if not, I got a copy for you.
Yeah. I don't.
Okay, I need your address. Let's talk offline. I'm gonna send you something.
Yes.
Okay.
that is the book that we stand on, From Here to Equality by Kirsten Mullen and Dr. Sandy Darity. It's economic based and historical based. And so it's a really great read for this particular space that you're in.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
It's our Bible to a certain extent. So Councilwoman Stepp, I want to talk a little bit about, because folks here locally in the Los Angeles chapter, we were involved in AB 3121 early on. We got engaged once we saw that bill come onto the assembly floor, onto the docket, and were instrumental in helping craft some language in there that not only made sure that we were going to see some specificity out of that bill that was going to be specific to our communities, because as you know, like with people of color or things of kind of labels like that don't really mean things. Language is important, right? So we have to be specific in who should be targeted by reparative policies and programs given the history of this country, right? So one of the things that and also the second thing that we worked on was making sure that it was understood that AB 3121 would not preclude federal reparations, because at the end of the day, reparations is a federal program. So I wanted to just get your thoughts around what the role California could play in influencing the federal program of reparations.
Especially since I love the way AB 3121 was written, because it's not limited to the state. Like the way the language is written in that particular bill, it actually opens up research for the nation, which I think was very smart of Dr. Weber, to make sure that was present, and the folks at the Bunch Center. And I'm gonna shout out Brother Chris from Sacramento also. But go ahead if you could and answer that question.
Yeah, I also think it was beautifully written, and I am grateful for that line that does not preclude us from whatever will ultimately we're working for at the federal level. So this conversation is so important, because I have been walking into a lot of spaces lately where the first inclination of someone who is Black is to, before we even have our own goals and what we need in our own agenda at the table, to include others before we even have our own agenda. And so I think that this separates what we need as African Americans, descendants of slaves. And I agree that, as California often does, not all the time, sometimes we're not as progressive as we think, but we do lead for the nation. What I really like about the way that this has been written, and what the task force will hopefully ultimately do, is bring forth the real conversation around reparations. The bill, and all of the bodies of work around this point to, slavery and state-sanctioned discrimination, legal discrimination, the not opportunities for Black people to hold certain jobs, the redlining, all the way down to the criminal justice system. It's all inclusive. And so I think having this conversation and presenting something that is specific, that outlines all of those things, but not only that, but what does reparations really look like? Like, how all encompassing is it? And what is that formula? How do you make up for generation after generation after generation of this state-sanctioned violence, really, against African Americans? How do you make up for that? And that, there are so many ideas. We've put the call out. We've been hearing all types of ideas from community members, some that have studied in this, some who haven't. And I'm looking forward to really bringing that forward, that conversation. We know that at the federal level, HR 40 has introduced all the time,
Yeah.
over and over
Since
and over.
1989.
And so,
Yep.
so we are hopeful that this will propel it forward.
Absolutely.
So we actually have a question from one of our viewers, and they are wondering whether or not commission members get staff. It sounds to me like someone would love to come work for you.
Well, no, unless I'm wrong. No, we do not. This is, like I said, even with limited capacity,
Yeah.
I'm going to be putting a whole lot into this. But I am looking forward to convening additional thought leaders around this in San Diego, because there are a lot of people that want to lend their expertise. But we, as commissioners, as far as I know, we do not get staff.
Okay.
But I know there are so many people that want to help.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, including us.
Right.
So we will stay in touch and stay in contact. This is, again,
this is exciting for us. Like, this is our sports, and this is what we eat, live, and breathe. So we are so glad that you were able to make some time for us today on Valentine's Day. But this is also a labor of love.
This is definitely a
so
labor of
it's the
love.
theme for the day.
Yes, absolutely.
It is.
Yeah.
And I'm a newlywed, so
That's right. Congratulations. Yeah, you married during the pandemic, right?
Yeah, I know it's crazy, but this is so important, and I believe we know how it feels to, have a baby in legislation, to carry something and really follow it all the way through, and want to see it have the impact and the spirit of that law. You want to see it come to fruition.
Absolutely.
So I am grateful for you having me here, and I'm hopeful that we can get it done. And I always am telling people, hold me accountable. Yep. If you think I don't know something, tell me.
Absolutely.
That's how we build relationships, and that's how we are strongest.
I love that. I love that.
I do.
We're going to talk. I got a book to send you, council member.
Yes.
I got a book, so we're going to talk.
I've been reading Frederick Douglass. I know that, but I want to see.
That's a great. That's never wrong. That's never the wrong answer. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Councilwoman Step.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you for having
here.
me.
We'll be in touch.
All right.
Okay, thanks.
So, we've had a show today.
This is a good one.
We've had a lot to digest.
Yeah.
We really, politics in Black is something that we really love to do, because we really want to make this community better advocates. Every bit of information we share, the people that we try and put in front of you, it's always from the lens of trying to be educating you on how to be better advocates, on how to get this life thing right. America has its limitations, and it's incumbent upon us to really lean into this reparation space, to really be unapologetic about it. Mm-hmm. We are modern day reparationists here in 2021. There is the HR 40 hearing on the 17th. It is
Wednesday.
going to be live streamed, so we want you to make sure you tune into the judiciary website.
We want to make sure you call in and email in the judiciary on Monday and Tuesday as well, fam. So
yes,
let's flood their email addresses. Let's flood their phone lines. Let's make sure they hear from us and they know that we need a markup session.
We need a markup session. This bill has gone to judiciary hearing 2 times. In neither occurrence has it actually entered a markup session. It's very important that we push the markup session. We know that there are edits that we want to see. One of the larger things that we talk about, and it goes back and forth with commissioners about being paid or being unpaid, but the reality is that 70% of United States commissions are unpaid. And because they're unpaid, we want to increase the chances of this legislation actually making it through by making changes to it that we know increase those those chances. And that's one of the things that actually does increase the chances. So call your council members, ask for the markup. We've been tweeting about edits. Make sure you tell them that we want these particular edits. There are about 6 of them, I think, altogether. If you haven't read From Here to Equality, this is a great time and a great reason to read it. If you're uninformed about reparations, that's a great book to get yourself caught up and informed.
Absolutely. I think you summed it up, Friday. We got work to do, fam.
We do. This next 48 hours is serious. Again, we are going to be going live on Clubhouse, or at least I am. Chad is not, because Chad doesn't do.
I don't do Clubhouse.
He doesn't do Clubhouse.
Do
he doesn't do the iPhone thing. But we will be going live because we really want to get into this. We want you to know who the judiciary members are. For those of you who paid attention to Juneteenth 2019, the gentleman Owens, God, his first name is escaping me right now.
Burris.
Burgess. Owens. He spoke as a Republican. This guy's an NFL guy. This guy had a wonderful life and a wonderful career. And even though he came from folks who, believe in, pulling yourself up by the bootstraps, the fact that it worked out for him because he was athletically inclined, I think is great. It's a wonderful human story. However, reparations is the key. Yep. And to the extent that this guy, he's not on the civil rights subcommittee, I want to make that clear, but if this legislation pulls through, that gentleman now has a vote. And so we really have to be very aggressive in getting our demands out there. Make it a family sport. It's a Sunday, we got Monday, and then we have Tuesday. Yep. It's very important that we use these next 3 days. Tell your friends, tell your cousins. Don't just retweet it. Yep. Tweeting is great, but we need you to actually pick up the phone and do those emails. There are scripts that we have online. I have a pinned script for anyone who wants it, but I am Friday Jones on social media. If you follow me, the information is there.
Absolutely.
All right.
And if you want to get engaged, fam, there's likely an NAASD chapter forming or existing around you. Reach out, get engaged. We're doing the work in this fight, and we're activated. We're ready to go. Before we go, though, it's Valentine's Day, so I got to show a little love here. I wanted to it's been a tough time for a lot of the family out here. So I wanted to send a special shout out to John from Los Angeles.
Yes.
Well, we understand, John, you lost your sister.
You lost his sister.
We want to lift you up, brother. We want to be here and be your strength through this tough time for you and your family. So just know the family's thinking about you. We love you, and we're praying for you. And secondly, I wanted to send a special shout out to Pastor Frederick K.C. Price.
And
that was a
family.
powerful voice and a powerful pastor who was loved by millions around this world, internationally known, who was preaching the gospel of reparations when I saw him, early on, and still to the end, towards the end. I just wanted to, send out love to everybody who loved him, because I understand that, losing a man of that stature can be painful, but also understand that he is now on the other side, and he didn't stop fighting, y'all. He's going to be fighting from over there. And so our job here is to pick up that sword and keep on marching.
Keep it on.
So with that said, Valentine's Day, go, love somebody today, y'all. Enjoy the rest of Black History Month. This is another episode of Politics in Black, and we'll be back in March.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Peace, fam.